This happened probably 5 or 6 years ago now. I think I was about 18 at the time. For starters, I live in a city where neighborhoods and forests kind of blend together. There are plenty of wooded areas where people go to have bonfires, parties, and other social get-togethers. One night, after discovering that all of our usual spots were crowded with people, I suggested that we go to a spot that I had been to a few times nearby. I'd been there plenty of times before, but only during the day. The street where we park is maybe 200 feet from the tree line. It's your average middle-class neighborhood. Nothing crazy is really known to happen there. So we walk in, we start our bonfire, and we're all having a good time. Some of us are drinking, some of us are smoking, myself included. About 45 minutes pass, and I'm a little intoxicated, but nothing major. Over the sound of our quiet music and my friends speaking, I hear something odd. I can't make out what it is, so I figure maybe I'm just hearing things. Maybe another 10 minutes pass, and I hear it again. A little better this time. It still sounds relatively far away, but the sound itself is like Velcro tearing. I stop and just kind of sit there trying to listen while my friends carry away laughing and talking. They haven't seemed to notice. And that's when I heard a sound I was very familiar with. A zapping noise, like you'd hear from a taser. Very brief, but absolutely unmistakable. My stomach drops, and I start looking around a little frantically. My girlfriend at the time was the first to notice my distress. She asked me what's wrong, and I explained to the best of my abilities, and she immediately begins to worry herself. She gets my friends to quiet down, and we all just sit there and listen for a bit. Then we all hear it. An electric zap. Brief again, but we all know that sound. The panic begins to emerge inside of all of us. We quickly put out the fire, while asking each other what the fuck that was, or where exactly it was coming from. We're all scared to walk out. It's only maybe a 5-minute walk to the street, but it's pitch black. We all muster the courage to finally walk the path out, and luckily we don't run into anyone. We finally reach the street, and begin walking to our cars, nervously laughing and relishing being under the street lamps again. I see him first. He's walking towards us, not at us, just walking in the direction we just came from, slightly to our right, and he's holding a stick of some sort. It scared me at first, but for a brief second, I calmed myself. It was a pretty safe neighborhood that I knew really well, and it was fairly common to see people out walking at night. But then I notice he's looking right at us. This stare is burned into my mind. As he passes us, my friends and I are all silent as we're having this stare down with a random man. And that's when it happened. He doesn't break eye contact. He holds up the pole and smiles this creepy, malignant smile. His eyes are open so wide. The end of the stick lights up bright, and that same zapping sound happens again. Much louder this time. He's holding a fucking cattle prod. We live in a city. There's no farmland nearby, and pretty much no reason to have a cattle prod. My friends and I are silently shitting ourselves as he walks past. No more than 20 feet beyond us, he makes a hard right and heads straight into the woods, without a flashlight or anything. We all got into our cars and peeled out of there as quickly as we could. Safe to say, we never went back to that spot again. I'm a 21-year-old guy, and about 12 years ago when I was 9, I was home alone with my 12-year-old brother. We were supposed to go to my aunt's house to have lunch and wait for my mom there. We always did this because we were too young to stay at home alone, according to my mom. We woke up at about 10:30 a.m. I took a shower, then my brother. After that, we were both in the bathroom brushing our teeth and finishing up our getting ready routine when we heard someone knocking on our door. Since every time someone knocked at our door, they turned out to be a salesman or Jehovah's Witness, we kind of waited for them to go away. So after a couple of moments of silence, I went to see if they were still outside through the window, and I saw nobody. What a relief. We continued getting ready when we saw a shadow go by the bathroom window. The window was small and square, made with that kind of glass that makes everything behind it really blurry. We waited and watched in case it was just a bird flying by. When a hand hit it, clear as day. We got scared, and we didn't know what to do. My brother had his cell phone, so he immediately called the police. While the line was ringing, we heard a loud bang at the front door. Someone was trying to brute force it. I don't know if they were kicking it or ramming it, but it was one of the most frightening things I've ever heard. My brother told me to lock the bathroom door, so I did. It took 5 loud attempts for the perpetrator to finally bash open the door. Then the police answered. I remember the exact thing my brother said. He was whispering the whole time, his voice barely audible. "Hello? There's someone in our house. I think they're trying to steal." Then a pause. "We're at our address." Another pause. "I'm with my little brother locked in our bathroom. Please hurry." I was sitting against the wall, hugging my knees. It was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences ever. I heard that man going through all of our things, emptying stands, going up and down the stairs, opening cabinets. He even broke a few cups and plates. I don't know why. Then I heard my cell phone being turned off, when I remembered that I left it on the kitchen table. I felt so stupid for leaving it out there. Things continued for a couple of minutes, when we heard him trying to open the bathroom door. My brother picked up the metal shower curtain rod that we had lying there and prepared for the worst. The man began kicking the door. "Who's there?" he screamed. We said nothing. Another kick, and then another. I felt I was about to have an anxiety attack. My chest started to ache. I had chills, but I was sweating through my shirt. I tried to remain calm, but it was just too much to take in. After a few kicks, he stopped. We heard the back door opening, and then silence. We waited for almost 10 minutes before leaving the bathroom. The living room was a total mess. Papers and books on the floor everywhere. All of our kitchen cabinets open, cups and plates smashed on the floor. In our mother's bedroom, the nightstand and the closet were open, with the contents of each spread all over the floor. Upstairs, in our room, it was the same thing. In about 5 minutes, the man was able to dismantle everything in our house, going through everything that we had, leaving a total mess behind. After that, my brother called our mother, and she ordered us to get to our aunt's house ASAP. So we did. When we got there, my racing nerves had subsided just a bit. My aunt was waiting for us with ice cream, probably because my mom had told her everything, and she wanted to calm us down as much as possible. We went back home at about 5 o'clock that afternoon. My mom told her boss she had a home emergency and left early. She tidied up the house, cleaned up, and left everything the way it was before so that we could be relaxed in our own home. I really appreciated her effort, as well as my aunt's to calm us down and do everything so we didn't have to think about what had just happened. According to my mom, the police got to the house just shortly after she arrived. She explained everything, but due to lack of evidence, nothing could really be done. The man was never caught to my knowledge, and honestly, I don't think they even really tried searching for him. The next few days, my mom stayed home from work with us. I'm sure she sensed just how shaken we were from this whole experience. Now I tell the story as a funny anecdote, because luckily no one was hurt, and the man only took useless stuff. But at the time, I was truly terrified. To a 9-year-old, an experience like that can have serious repercussions. I'm lucky it never came to that, and I got over that feeling that someone was going to come back into our house after a couple of weeks. As an adult, with a place of my own now, I take every precaution to make sure that I protect against this happening again. I have double locks on all my doors and windows, a full-on security system set up, and trust that if anybody were to ever get into my house again, I most likely wouldn't be hiding in a bathroom this time. I've got a very special welcoming gift for anybody trying to kick down my door. I worked the graveyard shift for a long time. One night, about 25 years ago, I had caught up with my night's work, but was unable to back up the work I had done. I decided to clock out and drive to Walmart to buy a box of new discs and leave the receipt for our bookkeeper so she could reimburse me. A few days after this incident, we learned that our computer had a virus that was corrupting floppy disks we were using. So you get the picture. Floppy disks for backup, no cell phones for most of us. It was an absolutely primitive time. I arrived at Walmart at about 3 a.m., went in, found the discs. I decided to visit the toy department, as it was early November, and I wanted to gather Christmas gift ideas for my son, as well as several nieces and nephews. While I browsed, I felt someone watching me. I looked around, and there were 3 men nearby, all of whom were staring right at me. I looked back at them long enough to affix their appearances in my mind, and went on looking at toys. I was in no hurry. I was off the clock, and wouldn't need much time to back up my work after I got back to the office, so I continued to look around, even strolled through the housewares for a few minutes. Every time I looked over my shoulder, though, those 3 guys were close and watching me. After the second time, alarms were sounding off in my head. They were repellent looking, with pasty pale faces, as if they spent all their time indoors, eating junk food, and their eyes were cold and hard. What disturbed me most was the way they were dressed, much too warmly for the weather that night. Even though it was November, it was about 55 degrees Fahrenheit outside. I was perfectly comfortable in a jean jacket. These guys were in heavy coats suitable for sub-freezing temperatures, and they had them buttoned to their necks inside the store. The only reason I could think of for that was that they were trying to conceal something beneath their coats, or full out hide something that they didn't want to be seen. I finally headed towards the cash registers, thinking that if no one else was leaving the store when I did, I would ask the cashier to call security and request an escort to my vehicle. As I reached the register, I saw my stalkers standing just inside the doors. They muttered amongst themselves for a moment as they decided to exit. As I was paying, a man and woman lined up behind me. I had seen them shortly before I neared the register, and they didn't seem to be paying any attention to me. I moved to the area between the registers and the doors and stood waiting for the couple, fiddling with my buttons, blowing my nose. When they did move towards the door, so did I, staying just a few steps ahead of them. I had parked not far outside, and I reached my vehicle swiftly. The stalkers were sitting in a car that was parked nose to nose with my pickup truck. I hopped in, locked the door, then sat back and stared right at them. The couple I had used as my unwitting escorts walked past me and the stalkers to get into a car a few spaces away. They left. After a minute or two, the stalker driver said something to the others, started the engine, and pulled away. I watched as they slowly left the parking lot, then ascended the nearby interstate highway overpass and took the entrance ramp. Only then did I start my engine. I took my time looking around as the engine warmed up. I continued along the street for a couple of miles past the interstate, then pulled into a dark lot behind a strip mall. I turned off my lights, engine, and I waited, watching the few vehicles that passed. I wanted to be certain that I wouldn't lead those guys to my office building, which was isolated and at that hour usually deserted except for me. After my pulse slowed to normal, I restarted the truck and returned to work. I'm a female, but I'm almost 6 feet tall and weigh about 175 pounds. I know that my size has protected me from a lot of mayhem over the years. I was also armed that night. I carried my loaded Smith & Wesson .357 revolver, as well as a speed loader, which is like an extra cylinder full of bullets. Still, I probably would have been no match for 3 determined assailants. This experience cured me of my nonchalance about running errands in the wee hours of the night, and validated my conviction that anytime I get the feeling of someone's eyes crawling over me, 'd be wise to look around and find the reason. About 3 months later, I My husband and I were watching the local evening news, and to my surprise and non-surprise, they showed photos of two of my stalkers who are currently wanted for armed robbery. So, career criminals who stalked me in Walmart one night, let's never meet again. This was a vague memory up until recently, when I spoke to my dad about a recurring dream that I was having. To my dismay, he confirmed that the dream was actually something that happened to me when I was younger, and filled in some of the hazy details. These details are what I'm going to share with you now. It was 1995, and I just moved into an upper-class neighborhood in southwest Florida. Compared to my previous neighborhood, it was full of professional adults, as well as elderly couples. This neighborhood was a haven full of children my age, and even a neighborhood park with a community pool. Things started to get weird right from the get-go. Just our third night in the new house, and I heard weird tapping on my window as I tried to fall asleep. Being as my bed was up against the wall where the window was, I wasn't about to sit up and investigate. The tapping continued for about 20 minutes, but I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I thought maybe it had been a dream, put it out of my mind for as long as I could. I got ready for school and went to the bus stop. While waiting for the bus, with my sister who was 2 years older than me, this older man comes walking up to the both of us and starts to talk about how he wishes his daughter was around on the weekdays so that he could see her off onto the bus and so she would have company on the ride to school. He then offered to drive us to school since the bus seemed to be late that morning in his own approximation. We knew better though, politely declined, feeling relieved when the big yellow bus pulled up a few moments later. He seemed disappointed, but still maintained a smile and told us to have a great day. We decided to tell our parents because we thought that they would get mad at us for talking to someone that we didn't know. That night, the creepiness reached a whole new level. I heard the same tapping on the window, only now it was more distinct and definitely stronger. I turned over, thinking my blinds would be down, only to realize in horror that they were pulled 3/4 of the way up. I was face to face with the creep from earlier, as he just stared at me. A slight smirk on his face. He told me to unlock the window so I could come outside and play with him and his daughter. Being on the spectrum, I trusted people way too easily, and as I thought about how fun it would be disregarding the time, I said in full sincerity, "Let me ask my mom." His face turned into the scowl I'll never forget, as he banged on the window and demanded that I open it immediately. At this point, my dad comes into the room and turns on my light. Having heard some of my side of the conversation, he pieced together what was going on and made eye contact with the guy for about 2 seconds before running outside after him. He didn't catch up with him, but he did call the police. It turns out the man did have a daughter that he had lost custody of due to being convicted of SAing her. She didn't live with him and had not done so in years. I don't remember what he was charged with, but I believe he spent a little time in prison since he was on the registry. To this day, I'm glad that my dad was so quick to jump into action, but I'm even more glad that we always kept our windows locked. Who knows the trouble that it kept me out of that night. When I was in high school, my best friend and I took college courses at a local community college because our school didn't offer AP, and it's common for low-income schools to connect their high-achieving students to nearby colleges instead. We were usually the youngest people in every class, since we started as juniors and were the youngest in our classes anyway. We were 16 when this all happened. Admittedly, we were very naive. Small towns do that to you. We had a composition class our first semester and made friends with 2 college freshmen who were cousins. We hung out a lot with them, and we were generally nice to everyone in the class, even the weird girl. And she was weird, like in a 2000s movies cliche weird girl. Long hair, big glasses, tall, willowy, and big-eyed. Plain Jane and soft-spoken, but friendly, even sweet. We sat by her, and one day we had to trade essays. I don't remember what hers was about, but it struck up a conversation between us, leading me to introduce myself and tell her what surrounding school I was from. She actually told us she lived about 10 miles away from there with her parents, and she worked at a local grocery store. This started a seed of friendship, but it never went too far because, while my friend and I were friendly, we were still very shy. We didn't really know how to make the transition between acquaintance and friend because our town was so small. Friends were kind of built in after a few years, you know? Every time I went to that grocery store, though, I saw her. I would use her as my cashier and tell her about my day and my life. Little things like, I'm applying to this college, and these snacks are for after the football game when I have a sleepover with friends. She always seemed so sweet, to the point where my friend and I promised we would go see a movie with her soon. This was an eventual thing that we didn't make solid plans for. We wanted to, but it just never lined up. During this entire time, she would give us little nuggets of information. Her parents were strict, she worked a lot, she's been homeschooled, she was going to the local college to be a nurse one day. One day I come home from school, and my mom shows me a local story on Facebook. A mother, father, and adult daughter had been arrested for abusing a foster child. He had been locked in the closet and kept there for months with little food or water. Sometimes he was forced to sleep in a dog cage. Somehow, he survived long enough for DHS to realize he was in bad shape and that he needed help. The adult daughter, as I'm sure you can guess, was the girl I went to class with. The girl I spoke to every week when I bought lunch for school. The girl I said I would see a movie with. The girl who tried to befriend me and my best friend for months. She had gone home every day and knew that a child was being horrifically abused and kept like an animal under her same roof, as she did nothing about it. She could have told someone. She could have told us. She wasn't locked away in that house. She spent at least 40 hours a week in that grocery store, ringing up little church grandmas and sweet old men, with a smile on her face that looked oh so genuine. In her mugshot, she looked 180 degrees different, so angry and mean. I didn't follow the case closely, but she's locked up now, and I haven't seen her since. What gets me the most is I sat in class with her. I read her essay, gave her editing tips. I spoke with her, gave her details about my life, and she told me about hers. I never had an inkling of the darkness that she was capable of hiding. She just looked like an awkward girl who hadn't yet grown into herself, like someone who wanted to make something of herself while checking out regulars at a tiny grocery store in a tiny town. But she abused a child, a boy who will spend a large portion of his life healing from that abuse, and I just never had a clue. I think of her sometimes, writing that essay that I read, comfortable in her bedroom, while in the next room, a boy is being forced in a closet with no food. He was only 5 years old. A baby. At any time, she could have told our professor, the college staff, anyone. She had the power to stop it, and she didn't. As an adult, I can see that she was most likely abused herself. Maybe not to that degree, maybe worse. And while I'd love to give her the benefit of the doubt, I just can't bring myself to it. I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is people can be really good at hiding things just below the surface, and you never really know who you're sitting next to in your English class. I'm a 20-year-old guy, although this took place when I was 13 or 14 years old. It's important that I note I've always been a bigger, older-looking kid. At the time, I was roughly 6'1", 200 pounds, and was in moderately decent shape since it was football season. I guess I just thought since I was such a big guy, nothing could ever happen to me. Well, this story is about the night that proved me wrong. This particular evening, I'd gotten into an argument with my parents and needed to take a walk to blow off some steam. I had a set route I'd usually take to get to this park located on the other side of my neighborhood. By the time I arrived at the park, nightfall had fully set in. I made my way to the only lit-up corner of the park, sat down at a bench, and began listening to music on my phone. At this point, I was completely comfortable in my surroundings, dropping my guard as this was during a time where my relationship with my family was just a bit strained, so coming here had become something of a regular occurrence. A few songs in, I noticed a car pull up to the unlit side of the park, and then immediately turn its headlights off. It was a silver SUV, but I couldn't tell what model or how many people were in the vehicle from where I was sitting. I didn't think much of it, though. This really wasn't anything out of the ordinary. My neighborhood is rather large and divided into multiple parts, so people would frequently get lost trying to navigate it. I simply assumed the driver had stopped to pull up directions on their phone. Nearly 10 minutes would pass, and the vehicle still hadn't moved, which began to make me a bit nervous for some reason. The thought crossed my mind that whoever was in the car could be watching me, and as unlikely as the thought seemed, it was enough to get me to want to leave the park. As I was getting up, the vehicle turned its headlights back on. A sick feeling formed in my stomach, and I quickly made my way out of the park, breaking my usual route to ensure I didn't have to go anywhere near that car. At this point, I didn't quite know what to do. I wanted to call my mom to come pick me up, but given the argument we just had, I stupidly convinced myself that calling her wouldn't be the right thing to do. I made my way to the end of the block, mentally preparing myself to wrap around the block and start heading back in the direction of the park, as that was the only way home. Just seconds later, as I reached the end of the street, the same car pulled out in front of me and came to a screeching halt. Not quite processing what was happening, I simply stopped walking and watched as the driver, an older man with a baseball cap and an unsettling smile that I could just barely make out in the darkness, said, "Hey, you okay, buddy? You need a ride somewhere?" There wasn't anything out of the ordinary about his voice, but as he spoke to me, my stomach tied itself in knots. All I could do was mutter out a soft "no" before the man reached all the way over and opened the passenger side door. "Hop in. We can go anywhere you like, buddy." Snapping out of my state of shock, I darted off behind the car without saying another word. I heard the man try to call out to me as I started running, but I couldn't make out what he said. I heard his car speed off as I continued to put as much distance between me and him as I possibly could. I made it a good few blocks away before I felt comfortable enough to stop running and decided to finally start making my way back home. Not long after, I heard a car coming up behind me as they slammed into a quick stop, which made my heart feel like it was going to shoot out of my chest. My nerves settled pretty quickly as I realized it was my mom, who set out to look for me after I didn't come home. She rolled down her window and began yelling at me to get into the car. But something was off in her voice. She didn't sound angry, just more panicked. I did as she said, asking what was wrong as we pulled off. She told me she had just been by the park to look for me and saw a car which had the same description as the one that I encountered, partially blocking the road to shine its headlights into the park. She says as she pulled up, the car quickly pulled back out and sped off. Call it mother's intuition, I guess, but she immediately assumed I was involved somehow. Though I denied anything happened, as I've never really been someone who can talk about anything real with my family, my mom still reported the car to the police, and that was that. I've never told my family what really happened, and haven't really ever spoken about this until now. The situation didn't stop me from going out for walks when I needed to de-stress, and I guess you can just credit that to me being a stupid teenage boy. I was certainly more cautious of my surroundings. Like I said, that was that. I never saw that man again. I never saw that car again. And I moved on with my life. I can look back now and use this as an interesting story to tell people, but I truly was incredibly lucky to get out of that situation unharmed. I still get the feeling that something bad would have happened if I hadn't decided to leave that park, or if I hadn't been able to get away. Would I really have been able to bring myself to fight back if needed? Maybe I wouldn't be here now, or maybe I'd be left with much, much worse memories of that night. All I can say without a doubt is that a man had truly awful intentions, and I'm sincerely lucky to be here now. Moral of the story: be careful when you go out for walks at night. Always be aware of your surroundings. It doesn't matter who you are. Anything can happen if someone has bad intentions. My grandparents used to live in a house located in a very secluded area, surrounded by woods. One of those situations where the nearest neighbor is about a half a mile away from their house. While they were all friendly, there really weren't very many situations where you would ever run into the neighbor out there. Whenever my grandfather had work, it would take him to town for a couple of days. He would then call me to take care of my grandmother, who suffered from debilitating arthritis. One night, it started to rain particularly heavily, and the power was in and out for most of the night, although mostly out. It was strangely windy, and because the house is 100 years old, you can hear various creaks, shifts, moans, generally disconcerting noises around the house. Around 1 a.m., and the entire house is quieted down. My grandmother and I are both in our beds. The dog is quiet. Everything is off. I'm quickly awakened by a loud pounding sound at the front door. Not sure at first if it was my imagination or a dream. My real-life concern grows as I hear more knocking a few moments later. My grandmother was still asleep, and I didn't want the noises to wake her. But that noise had freaked me out, because it was improbable for someone to be out at this hour, and it was even more unlikely for someone to be outside of our house. But I thought, maybe it's my grandfather. Maybe there was some emergency that brought him back home at this hour. As I walk downstairs to investigate, the knocking stops. As I set foot into the living room, I catch a glimpse of our dog, who's sitting in the corner, staring at the door, tail between his legs, cowering if I've ever seen an animal do so. At this moment, I figured that something wasn't right, and that if someone was indeed outside of our door, it obviously wasn't my grandfather. I went back upstairs to see if I could see who it was through the window, and I believe I saw a shadow. I'm not sure if it was actually a person's shadow or what. It could have easily been patio furniture or something else twisting in the wind. Either way, I didn't go back downstairs to open that door. I stayed hunkered in bed, and to my relief, there were no more knocks that night. I eventually settled back into sleep, but when I woke up in the morning, all the thoughts still raced through my mind at what could have possibly woken me up in the middle of the night. Still wondering to myself if it could have indeed been a dream, I stepped outside onto the front porch and saw two things that still give me chills to this day. The first was a set of muddy footprints heading from down the stairs up towards the front door. It looks as if they settled right there before pacing the front porch and ultimately heading back down the stairs once more. The second and most frightening thing that I saw came as I turned my attention to the front door. It appeared as if there were gouges or stab marks where the door meets the frame. These gouges were about a half an inch deep, and the more I looked, the more it seems like they were meant to pry open the door. And that's when it occurred to me. There was no emergency outside last night, just a person trying to get inside. While the house itself may be 100 years old, the door was substantially newer, and obviously strong enough to withhold anybody's advances to try to brute force it open. It was a terrifying realization for me to know that as I stood in the living room, in the middle of the dark, there was a stranger, a mere few feet away from me, trying to get inside, to do only God knows what. My grandparents lived at that property for a few more years before they ultimately passed on, and I never slept well in that house again after that night. While I miss them both dearly, I'm glad to never have to spend another night on that property ever again. my daughter is 3 years old and quite verbose. While her language and vocabulary skills are impressive, it's her memory that gets me every time. It's absolutely fantastic. She will put something of hers away, the teeniest, tiniest of things, and remember a week later just exactly where she put it. Or if I set my glasses down for a bit and then can't find them because my vision is just plain awful, she'll remind me that she saw them earlier in a certain room next to a very specific item. Definitely a very keen and aware child. Just last week, she told me, "Mommy, do you remember the first time we got Pearl, our corgi, and she was a baby, and you let her ride in my lap all the way home? I liked that." She was just 18 months old when that happened. I had just gotten Pearl, and we were in the car headed home. I asked if she wanted to hold the pup while she was buckled into her car seat. Crazy memory skills, right? Okay, so that was for backstory. About a month ago, she asked me if I remembered when she was in my belly. I said, "Of course I remember. You loved to stretch and got the hiccups every single day." I laughed and went on about her hiccups, and she laughed along with me. Suddenly, her countenance changed, and she looked a little morose. After a moment or two, she asked me a question that rattled me to my core. "Do you remember when I was in your belly and he threw the remote at you? You were very scared." My ex, her biological father, was and is a real piece of work. Classic controlling narcissist with a temper. I had wanted to leave him long before we ever conceived. I was about 7 months pregnant at the time, and out of nowhere, he blew up at me and began yelling. I jumped off the couch as quickly as I could and ran behind it so there would be a barrier between us. He yelled some more, and then threw the TV remote at my stomach. I swatted it away with my hand, so thankfully it didn't hit me or hurt her in any way. After more yelling and screaming on his end, I called a friend, made a go bag, got my keys, and left him. It had been a long time coming, and that was the final straw. My daughter has never been told that story, as it wouldn't be appropriate. I've never talked about it with people in front of her, at any age. Again, not appropriate. That's her father, and as shitty as he is, I refuse to speak negatively about him to her. I will honor and protect their relationship, provided that it stays healthy. She's never heard any kind of anything about him that would put him in a bad light, and that narcissist would never admit any wrongdoing ever, nor would he ever mention that incident to her. Yet somehow, she still knows. "Do you remember when I was in your belly and he threw the remote at you? You were very scared." Yes. Yes, I was. I'm a 36-year-old man, and this encounter would have happened a little over 10 years ago. I think I was about 26 or 27 at the time, but I can't be 100% on what year it was, although it was sometime between 2011 and 2013. At the time, I was frequently going out with my friends to bars and parties, hanging out until pretty late most weekends. The friend's house that I usually hung out at was on a side street, just off a main road where a lot of popular and crowded bars and restaurants were. You had to park on the street at his house, and during the weekend when it was busy, it was pretty common to have to park a few blocks away. The street closer to the bars was pretty nice, but if you went a few blocks in the opposite direction, it got a little sketchier at night. After a night of hanging out, I had to walk back to my car pretty late, which was parked a number of blocks away towards the slightly sketchier area. This was during the winter, so I was wearing some kind of heavy sweater or pullover and a beanie knit hat. This detail is only important, as you couldn't really gather much idea about what I looked like from a distance in the dark, aside from my general height and build. There wasn't much through traffic as you got farther away from the bars, and the roads were pretty dark without any streetlights. As I was walking down the sidewalk, a car started slowly creeping down the street, matching my pace as it pulled up beside me and then stopped. The window of the car rolled down, and driving the car was an attractive young woman who said that I looked cold and that I should let her give me a ride to where I was going. She seemed super friendly. I indicated that I wasn't parked very far away and appreciated the offer, but I was just going to keep walking. She then tried really hard to convince me to get in the car with her, since it was, quote, so cold. No small talk to establish any information about me, to make sure that I wasn't a weirdo. Just requests for me to get in the car, and pretty aggressively at that. Based on what I was wearing and how dark it was out, there was no way she could have had an idea about what I actually looked like to possibly find me attractive. And even if she did, I don't know many women who would pick up a male stranger after midnight when they're alone in their car. There were about 10 bars nearby she could have gone to if she just wanted to pick up a guy. There was no reason I could think of that she would have had to resort to driving around offering to pick up strangers. She continued to drive alongside me and offered me a ride again, which I declined once more and kept moving. I picked up my pace, and she eventually drove off. As soon as she was a few blocks away, I quickly got to my car and made sure there was nobody lurking around or nearby. The whole scenario just felt off, and it didn't make sense to me. I asked my friends about it later, and all of the women in our group agreed. They wouldn't offer a random guy a ride during the night in that kind of scenario, even if the guy looked like Ryan Gosling or Channing Tatum. My suspicion was that there was someone laid down in the back seat of the car, out of view, with a weapon waiting to rob anyone who accepted the ride. I couldn't really figure out any reason she would be offering rides like that to complete strangers in the middle of the night, as it would be very unsafe for her to just pick up a stranger. I just assumed there had to be something nefarious going on in that car, and I do wonder what would have happened if anyone just hopped in it with her. My hopes are that nobody fell into that trap. Stay safe out there, my friends. My friends went to Mexico for a vacation, and they asked me to house sit and take care of their dogs while they were gone. They pay me $40 a day just to sit around and let the dogs out when they need to go. I'm disabled, so the funds really help a lot. This is a semi-rural area, and houses are roughly a quarter mile apart. Police have to come from town, 15 miles away, and the response time can be well over an hour in the worst cases. I always take my pistol with me. It's always been quiet when I've stayed there. But this time was different. I was in the shower when the dog started barking and growling. They're both big, intimidating German shepherds, and one is actually police trained. The owners loan him to the county as a drug dog sometimes, and if you tell them to be quiet, they typically obey. This time they didn't, so I went on high alert. I shut off the water and looked out the window. I didn't see anything, but when I walked out of the bathroom, I saw a shadow go across the bedroom window. I whispered to the dogs to hush, and they did as they were told. That's when I heard a man's voice. I couldn't make out everything he was saying, but I distinctly heard 2 words.
Come around.
So from this point, I'm absolutely sure that there was more than one person. I ran into the living room with my pistol and saw the door handle turn. I yelled, "I have a gun, and I'll f***ing use it." Just then, I heard feet run away. I was telling Siri to dial 911 and got the county sheriff fast. She said that there were 2 cars on another call, not far away, but it would likely take them about 20 minutes to get there. That's better than the usual hour, but I was pretty shaken to say the least. I explained that I was on a farm and would have to go down to the road and unlock the cattle gate to let them in, and to please tell the officers that I would be carrying a pistol and to not shoot me by mistake, because I wasn't going outside the house without it. The dispatcher said, "Oh no, don't go out there without your gun. I'll tell them." That's the one good thing about living in a red state, I suppose. She asked if I could see the road, and I can, so she said to wait in the house until I saw blue lights. I hung up and called my friends in Mexico. Their camera footage can be downloaded via an app, and they said they would go through it while I waited for the cops. I locked the house down and went down to the gate when the police arrived. They searched the whole place, including the barn, but didn't find a single soul. While they were looking, my friends texted me the camera footage, and there was for sure a man on the porch earlier. Unfortunately, the cameras weren't angled to get a shot of his face, and it was dark, of course, so I don't know how much would have been seen anyway. I still think there was more than one creep, because of what I remember hearing him say.
Come around.
The police were very nice and said they had passed a man on a bike on their way there, which is strange for this area, especially at night. They went to look for him, but that's about all they could do. They took a full report, but never caught anybody. My husband came up and stayed with me the rest of their trip. One of the neighbors said he found a tent and some gear in the woods a few weeks back, so somebody was living out there, perhaps a homeless person from town. I've house sat for this couple again since then, and it was all quiet. They're going away again for Christmas, so I'll definitely be there once more. A lot of people ask me, would I have shot the creep had he broken in? Yeah, absolutely. I'd be sorry that I had to hurt somebody, but if it's them or me, well, I think you know what I'm picking. There have been some strange things happening recently, and I'm posting this not just to share the story, but also looking for answers. Trigger warning, there are multiple things about this story that are rather unsavory. Abuse, stalking, baby death, giving you the heads up right now. My girlfriend's mother is a longtime drug user, and has been in and out of jail for my girlfriend's whole life. When she lived with her mother and her mother's husband, she witnessed physical abuse and ample drug activity. She was forced to move out at a very young age in order to stay alive. She thought her mother was finally clean when her mother announced her pregnancy. After getting over the initial shock, my girlfriend decided to be supportive of her mother, since she thought that she had left her demons in the past and left her old life behind. That was until her mother overdosed while pregnant. She decided to cut all contact at that point. My girlfriend is also a mandated reporter, and last year, she reported her mother and her stepfather to the state, since she knew it wasn't a safe situation for a baby. The baby died in their house not even a month after birth, due to an overdose, with signs of physical abuse as well. My girlfriend's mother was arrested for the murder of her baby. Her husband was arrested for child endangerment, and other charges very recently as well. At first, the judge didn't grant either of them bail. Eventually, her husband was granted bail, in which he posted. We didn't know this until recently, which helped us to put together some of the pieces of this puzzle. My girlfriend and I like to sit outside of her house, in the car, and just chat or listen to music. But recently, there have been black cars around my girlfriend's house. She's also told me how she's followed by cars she doesn't recognize when she drives me home. It's the same couple of black cars that do this. They're not just random ones. At first, we thought we were just being paranoid, since everyone was still in jail. But when we found out that the husband was out, we began to doubt our insanity. The first major thing happened after my girlfriend and I went on a dinner date. We got home after dark and sat in our car for about 45 minutes before we noticed the same black car passing by us every few minutes. After 10 minutes of that, a different car drove towards us, flicking its high beams on when it got close enough for us to see who was inside. It swerved into the oncoming lane, and I genuinely thought it was going to hit the passenger side of the car. As it sped away, we ran inside. After that, we started noticing the black cars more and more often. This past Wednesday morning, around 3 a.m., the same distinct black van that we had been seeing pulled up outside of my house. This was weird because my girlfriend and I live about 30 minutes from each other, in two separate cities. A man got out of the van and shined a flashlight through my yard, looking as if he was scanning it. He shined the flashlight up at the window where I was sitting at, kept it there for a second, then walked 30 feet to an empty driveway, scanned around there for another 20 seconds before getting back in the van and pulling off. The windows were ice-covered and frozen, so I couldn't make out the specifics of the van, but I knew it was strange. A few nights later, my girlfriend and I spent some time hanging out in the car when we spotted a black van hiding behind another parked car further up the street. We could only see one headlight, but it crept by us as we sat in the car. My girlfriend lives between two dead-end streets. Think of a very blocky U. She lives between the two prongs. The van went up the first dead end, 4 ways on, and sat for a few minutes before turning around and driving almost into the other lane of traffic to get close to us. It then went up the other dead end and stayed put. We thought it was weird that the van didn't just back out of the first dead end, instead opting to drive all the way up the narrow street to turn around. After a few minutes, we call a friend and recount the story just to get an extra opinion. While my girlfriend was talking to her friend, I got out of the car to go for a cigarette and to see how far away the van was. I walked up the dead end that van was on for about 15 feet before getting the worst gut feeling I've ever gotten. Across the street from me was a black mass. It was darker than the darkness around it. I decided to just turn around and rush my girlfriend into the house. Later that night, we heard a bang coming from downstairs, followed by what sounded like a boot on wooden stairs. We locked the bedroom door, and I sat against the door with a baseball bat, hopeful to barricade it. A few moments later, we heard a car door slam before the sound of tires squealing and driving away filled the neighborhood. Our initial idea was that maybe it came from the TV, but we had it paused, and the TV in the next room is never loud enough to feel real. When I went downstairs an hour later to get water, there was nothing damaged or missing. We theorized that maybe it was the sound of the front door trying to be opened, even though it was deadbolted. My girlfriend's exterior wall doesn't face the road, and we've never heard car sounds before. The next day, I was shoveling the sidewalks at my girlfriend's house, an activity that normally takes about 20 minutes, and I saw the same black Chevy Silverado with mud streaks on the tailgate. It circled the block about 4 times. I was able to get a good look at the silhouette of a man driving through the passenger side window, and I'm sure it was the same man and same truck each time. My girlfriend lives in a small town, and we were able to catalog the neighborhood cars. The black van and truck didn't belong to anybody, so it was certainly abnormal. Our theory is that someone is trying to scare my girlfriend into not testifying, or flat out making sure neither of us ever have the ability to testify. Kinda just wanted more opinions. Are we being paranoid? Or is this something we should actually be worried about? Do you think that these are weird coincidences? Or something more? My name is Corey, with an I. Not Corey with a Y, or Corey with an EY. C-O-R-I. A usually feminine spelling of a name for a guy. Not that I mind much of what spelling or so on my parents gave me. A few years ago, I had just been let go from my first job out of college. It had been pretty good money, but the company went under. So I started applying to every job I could find, as you do. Indeed, Monster, even Craigslist. One Craigslist job in particular was based on the outskirts of the city that I lived in, but I was ready to take on anything. The job in question was some basic data entry and assistant work. At least that had been what the job listing said. I thought it was on the up and up, however, because this was one of the few Craigslist postings that had a website attached to it. It was a pretty basic website in retrospect, but the company message seemed to make it sound like they were heavily about serving the city and facilitating volunteer work. Within minutes of applying, I got a response inviting me for an interview that same day, though it titled me as a Miss Corey. I was going to respond to correct them, but it read that it was an automated message, so there would be no one to read it. I figured I'd just have to correct them once I got there, and again, it didn't seem like a big deal. I'd gotten this once or twice before in my life. I drove to the location that the company website listed, and it didn't seem too out of the ordinary. It was the second floor of a small building that was sandwiched in between a pawn shop and a phone store. I didn't think too much of it because this was a big city, and even if this job was on the outskirts, a job was a job. I looked up to the second floor of the outside and saw someone looking down at me. I couldn't make out the face, but it was for sure a person. That much I know. I went inside the building and took the elevator up to the second floor, but didn't see a single person. It looked like a half-finished office floor from what I remember, with some doors opened and some locked shut, but there was simply no one to speak to, no one to inform that I was here. There was one cubicle, but one of the detachable walls had been left in another office room. There was a computer monitor in one room, but no desktop attached to it. A half-finished company banner and a bookcase were all that adorned the walls. On closer inspection of the bookcase, all of the books weren't books, but cardboard printings of a bunch of books stacked together. I finally had too much, called the phone number that had been on the website, but I heard no phone ringing from where I stood. Moreover, the phone I called seemed to cut my call off after a ring and a half, sending me straight to voicemail. Sufficiently creeped out by now, and wondering if I had stumbled on something I shouldn't have, I went back to the elevator and took it down. As the elevator doors closed, I heard someone muttering angrily.
I thought that was a girl's name.
I didn't want to stay and find out who said it. Instead, I walked right back to my car and drove back home, not even daring to look back up at the window where I saw somebody standing before. That very evening, out of a morbid curiosity, I checked Craigslist. The posting was now gone. I looked for the website. It had been disabled. To this day, I still wonder what or who did I stumble upon. My greatest regret was not telling the police about this right after it occurred. This story happened to me relatively recently, and it's probably why I'm still so charged up about the event. I know I'm at least a little bit at fault for the actions that occurred, but I'm hoping that telling the story will help me move past it, as well as maybe, just maybe, saving anybody else from making the same mistake, given the same odd circumstances. My family and I live in Costa Rica. It's a beautiful country. Lush rainforests, amazing people, but that's not to say it's the perfect country by any means. A while ago, I went with my wife and son to visit a family friend and their parents in another state. They lived in one of the bigger towns of this particular state. We stayed there for a few days, but on the third day, I think, our friend's father grew sick and had to be hospitalized. He's fine now, thank goodness. My friend's mother explained to me that the father was supposed to go and drop a van off to his brother in a town about 3 hours away. The brother's family were desperate for the van because they were moving houses, and with the father being in the hospital now, there would be no one to do the task. I told them not to worry. I'd take the van and come back by bus the same evening. So I set off the next day along the highway. I made good time and arrived in the small town in about 2.5 hours. I met the brother, had some food with his family, and then about 10 p.m., set off to the bus area to make my way back. When the bus arrived, I realized that it was more like a local bus. Small, kind of old, relatively cramped. It definitely wasn't the big motor coach that I had expected. Including myself, there were only 5 other people on the bus. What I immediately noticed was that the bus wasn't taking the paid highways like I did. It was taking the long, and to be honest, more dangerous route. Latin America can have some dangerous sights. About 2 hours in, the driver stopped because he wanted to smoke. So I stepped out to relieve myself. I finished before the driver did his cigarette, and I decided to jump back onto the bus, grab my own cigarettes, and have one too. The driver must have seen me get on, but not get back off, because as I stood there behind the bus, it suddenly began to drive off. I was listening to music on my headphones, so it took me a second to even realize. And by that point, it was too late. So here I was, on this road in the middle of the jungle, with nothing in sight. The full moon overhead did provide some light, so it's not like I was completely blind out there. I decided to walk the way the bus went. Now, as I walked, I started to get a little worried about the wildlife. There are jaguars and other forest predators here. However, another thought that I had was, what would I do if I saw a car? The obvious thing you think is that I should flag it down, tell them the story, and they would help. But I'm not in the US or Europe. I feel immediately that this could be dangerous. And I think my gut reaction helped me immensely that night. So I'm walking along for about half an hour, and I haven't made my mind up entirely on if I were to stop a car if I saw one. Then I see light coming down the road, accompanied by very loud music. I'm walking past a small, empty bus stop at the same second, which has a bench in it and a light. The first piece of civilization that I've seen since the bus left me. At this point, I dart past the bus stop, into the tree line, and I duck right out of sight. I'm worried about snakes and spiders, and also thinking I might be stupid for hiding here instead of flagging the car down. But part of me said that I was making the right choice. The car pulls up right near the bus stop, and it's not a car. It's actually 3 big pickup trucks, with about 10 people in total. Each of them armed to the absolute teeth. They jump out, and it looks as if they're wrangling 2 or 3 more people out of the back of one of the pickup trucks. As I look for my hiding spot, I can see that the final people out of these trucks have their hands bound and hoods placed over their heads. I can see knives, and I realize that an execution is about to take place. I duck down at this point, thinking of movies where hidden observers are spotted simply because they're being too nosy. I try to hide my head to the best of my ability and conceal myself, thinking that if I can just make it past this point unscathed, I'd still have an opportunity to make it home safe. I close my eyes tight and cover my ears, thinking that some ungodly sound or some horrendous screams are soon to infiltrate my ears. But that's not what I hear at all. After a few moments of silence, I hear the sound of tires squealing and those trucks all driving off. As I poke my head into the clearing, I don't see a soul. No captors, no victims, no bodies strewn around on the ground. Just empty space. As I gather my wits about me, thankful that I didn't witness a beheading, I'm even more thankful that I didn't attempt to flag down these trucks. Who knows the situation it could have put me in had that been the case. In the end, I completely changed my direction. I got to the nearest town about 2 hours later, sat on a park bench through the night until the first crack of daylight, before finding my way to the nearest bus stop and safely returning back to my friend's parents' house. I reckon that I'm pretty lucky. I always think what would have happened had I stopped those trucks. I'm glad that I'll never have to find out. I'm currently 25 years old, and this story happened to me back when I was still living at my parents' house. I was commuting to college at the time, and had 3 siblings that also lived at home, my brother and 2 younger sisters. For some context, we lived on 5 acres in rural Ohio, surrounded on both sides by woods and farm fields. Additionally, during the week, my dad would leave for work at around 2 a.m., So I had always felt like it was my job to be the man of the house, because he was gone during the times when you would imagine something sketchy were to happen. However, because it was the weekend, my dad was home this evening. I woke up to the sound of my brother's voice trying to get my attention. We had separate rooms upstairs, and coming out of our rooms you could look down over the banister to see our front door. When I woke up, it took a few moments to get out of the haze and realize what was going on. I looked at the clock, and it read 2:35 a.m. My brother told me that there were 2 men at our front door. That sentence hit me like a whole pot of coffee, and now I was wide awake. We quietly walk out of my room and peek over to look down at the front door. As we look, there was no one at the door, but I did notice my parents off to the side, out of view from the glass window that served as part of our front door. I whispered down to my dad, and he told me that there were 2 guys who had been talking to each other and knocking on the door. Hearing my dad say this freaked me out even more. I quickly went back into my room and grabbed my pistol, shuffling down the stairs after looking to make sure that there was no one at the door. If they had been, they would have easily seen me trudging down the stairs, holding a firearm, as it was in direct view from the door. My brother is right behind me as we head over to where my parents are, whispering to try to find out what's going on. My parents had awoken to the sound of our dog barking and had come out to find these 2 men knocking loudly at the door. At this point, the men return and begin pounding away again, despite the fact that no one had come to the door in the first place, and our dog was still actively barking. The fact that they were there at this time, in a location where houses are spread out hundreds of yards, and still knocking, made the situation even more terrifying. After a couple of minutes, the men walked away, and we all shuffle across the kitchen into the family room to peek out the windows that overlook our driveway. Our outdoor light casts a beam over a black Cadillac sitting in our driveway, but no one was inside from what we could see. Immediately, the next question to spring to mind was, where did these guys go? They weren't in the car, and they were no longer at the front door. Unfortunately, we figured out the answer when the handle to our back door began to jiggle. They were now trying to enter the back door of our house, which enters right into the kitchen. At this point, I just remember my mom frantically saying, "David," to my dad, as pure terror overwhelmed her. Then 2 things happened. Adrenaline filled my body as I prepared my handgun, horrified at the very real possibility that I might have to shoot someone. Secondly, my dad finally grabbed the phone, called the police, and calmly explained to them what was happening. Thankfully, after a few moments of jiggling, they stopped at the back door and disappeared once more, only to return to the front of our house and pick up their knocking at the front door once again. But by this point, several minutes had gone by, and we began to see the local police fly up in multiple cruisers with their lights on. As they whipped into our driveway and front yard, the 2 men bolted, attempting to run the long way around the house across the driveway. One of them disappeared out of view, but the other one was intercepted by an officer yelling for him to get on the ground. When he didn't, he was promptly tased and fell to the ground anyway. Some of the officers went around the house after the other guy, while another officer came to talk to my dad and I as we exited the house. They ended up finding the other man hiding in my sister's playhouse in the backyard. It appears that both of them were drunk or high, as the one who hid had drugs on him. While they were both arrested that night, we never did find out what they were charged with, what happened to them, or why they were even there. Needless to say, the whole experience wasn't very fun. And while I hope to never have to relive this moment, I'm incredibly grateful that both my father and I were there during this whole ordeal with our family, that I had my protection in my hand, and that we're firm believers in locking our doors. I do believe that that was the difference that night. When my daughter was 2 years old, I was having a tough time as a single mother and decided to take a road trip up Highway 1. I made reservations in Trinidad at a cool cabin in the woods within walking distance of the beach. Before I left, my stepfather gave me a loaded .38 revolver, which I stored under the driver's seat of my car. Sometime after driving through San Francisco, it was very late and dark, and there was nobody on the highway. My daughter was sleeping peacefully in her car seat next to me. Back then, we could legally have car seats in the front. I noticed a car coming up behind me, but as they switched lanes to pass me, they slowed down, driving parallel alongside of me. I sped up and slowed down, but I couldn't shake him. I looked over and this guy had his interior light on and was furiously gesturing for me to pull over. I knew I had to find a safe place, but there was nobody else on the road, and I was starting to run low on gas. There was just nothing on this highway for miles. I kept driving and kept driving, but this guy wouldn't leave me alone. I was getting very frightened, but the mama bear was coming out, and I was getting very angry as well. I knew that he could see my kid, and the fact that he was attempting to menace me just made me that much more furious. Finally, we reached a point where there was an exit up ahead and a gas station in the middle of nowhere, so I took the exit with the guy closely following me. I wasn't sure what to do. The gas station was brightly lit, but it had no other customers. I didn't feel as if it was safe for me to pull in, so I slowly passed it, drove further into the dark, deserted landscape, and pulled into a large dirt area and drove quite a ways off the highway with him following. Absolutely nothing around. I knew I was in big trouble, and I needed to take control and put him into a vulnerable position. Mama Bear was in full protective mode, and I was pissed. I stopped the car, grabbed the gun, and jumped out, locking the car right behind me. As he pulled up, I ran around to the passenger side and waited. He then got out of his car and quickly moved towards me as I suddenly raised the gun up, visible only in the moonlight. He came to a halt, surprised, and then I leveled the gun across the car, taking direct aim as I waited. He stood there, weighing his options, then turned around, got back in his car, and left. Not a single word was spoken, but it absolutely terrified me. I know for a fact that his intentions weren't good, but I was planning on meeting force with force, and I had the benefit of 6 rounds in my revolver, and I'll tell you right now, I wasn't going to miss. I'm a woman in my 20s, and I wanted to share this experience because as a child, it was absolutely terrifying. When I was 12 years old, maybe a little bit older, I was waiting for my ride after school one day when this big white family van pulls up in front of me that has a man driving it who asked me if I was waiting for my ride. My family owns a big white van just like this, so it wasn't suspicious to me right off the bat. But I was a naive child, and the stranger danger of the situation just didn't register with me at that moment. Looking back at it, he asked a rather obvious question as well, because here I was, sitting outside the school by myself, although I answered anyway. Then he asked what my name was. I hesitated for a moment, but he explained that he was looking for someone that he was tasked to pick up, so I gave it. I told him my name was Thea, and he said, "Oh, so it's you. Your mom asked me to come pick you up from school." He then introduced himself as Sam, my mom's nephew. But truth be told, I had never met any of my mom's family, so he could have told me he was anyone, and I would have been none the wiser. Eager to get home and out of the cold, I didn't question him much, even though I was skeptical. I just jumped in the car, and thinking back on it now, I realized just how dumb that was. I got in, we started driving towards the opposite direction of my house. At first, I thought no big deal, because there was a route this way that led to my house. It was just what we called the long route. But soon, we were passing that way too, and out of nowhere, I realized we were on the highway. At this point, any trace of happiness in me to be out of the cold quickly left my body as I found myself on the edge of tears. I asked him if he could please take me home, and that if my mom sent him, then he should know that I'm not really allowed to go out after school. But he just ignored me. At this moment, I officially began bawling my eyes out, and cars that were passing us on the highway or standing next to us in traffic began to stare. At one point, I was crying so much that he slammed his hands on the steering wheel and started mumbling how this would just be easier for both of us if I would shut up. My thoughts may have been all over the place at this point, but I knew that anything would be better than making it to wherever he was taking me. So in a moment, I decided that as the car slowed down, I was going to unlock my door and jump out. As we were in traffic, that moment presented itself rather swiftly. In all honesty, I wasn't thinking at all, because if I thought about it, I would have chickened out right then and there. And for once, I thank God that I didn't think twice. I hit the ground and landed on my left leg. The pain was so bad, but I didn't care, because in my head, anything was better than staying in that car. The guy didn't even bat an eye. I feel like in the chaos, I saw him try and grab me, but once I freed myself from the passenger seat, he just sped away. As I'm laying in the far right lane of a semi-busy highway, I look up and see a car barreling down on me, just as they hit their brakes and come to a screeching halt. When the woman driving realized that I was just a child, laying in the middle of the road, she turned her hazards on and ushered me to the shoulder of the highway, where she sat and waited with me until the police showed up. I remember that the police and my parents showed up at roughly the same time. I told the police what had happened, to which my parents were shocked that I would just willingly get in the car with a stranger, although the relief of having me safe overwhelmed them to no end. I remember this being the last time I was ever allowed to wait for my ride after school by myself, something that lasted all the way up through high school. Whenever I got out of class, I was sure to meet my parents at the curb, where they would undoubtedly be waiting for me. I never saw that man in that white van again, nor do I know what happened to him. But my hope of all hopes is that he never found another child as naive as myself to attempt to prey on again. I want to start this story off by saying that everybody involved is safe, but it was one of the closest calls I've ever had in my life, and I feel like I have to tell my story in order to raise awareness. I live in a major city, in practically the pit of hell state. Born and raised here, I'm very familiar with my surroundings. I'm also aware of the fact that my city is one of the worst hubs for human trafficking, and living here can be very, very dangerous. Despite all of this, I've taken pride in knowing that I do everything I can to remain as safe as possible. I've had plenty of close calls before, and consider myself an avid murderino. I'm pretty prepped. At the time, I had 2 things of pepper spray, one in my favorite jacket pocket, one velcroed to my desk at work. I also had 2 trusty pocket knives, one always on me, one in my car door pocket. Oh, my taser never leaves my bag as well. I avoid shady situations, and despite being a small lady, I know my stuff. Hooray for self-defense classes. My point is, I'm a pretty paranoid small chihuahua, and I still got into a scary situation. But on to the story. It's summer, and hot as hell out. I've got a date with my favorite gal pal, and I swing by her place to pick her up. She tells me she has a job interview to go to first, and I agree to go with. No big deal. She's a sweet tiny thing from a small town in the Midwest, and very new to city life, and the wild things that can happen here. As we drive into a different city, I ask her about the job. Oh, it's a modeling gig. Cool. For who? I found an ad on Craigslist. It's just sports clothes. The Craigslist thing sets a small, distant alarm off in my head, but I push it to the side. Where the heck are we going? When we pull up to a Starbucks a bit outside of the city, the alarm in my head becomes a little less faint. Relax, I tell myself. I've gone to legit job interviews at coffee shops before. There's always been a good reason. We arrive first, late still, but end up waiting about 15 minutes. Kinda weird, but she's relieved we're not the rude ones when we get a text saying that he's here. I look around the Starbucks, and outside in the parking lot, trying to figure out who the mystery man can be, when I notice a tall, well-dressed man step out of a black SUV. He smiles at us as he approaches, and I figure that's our guy. I could have sworn that SUV had been parked there for a while, though. I ask my friend if she wants me to step in line and grab her a drink, but she practically begs for me to stay with her. Okay, I can do that. I didn't think it'd look very professional, but I don't protest. The man, named Jack, leads us to an isolated table outside and doesn't say much about my presence, other than it was okay for me to be there. I get on my phone and shoot a text to my fiancé explaining where I was and what I was doing. He shoots back a "be careful" in response, and I sit pretty to watch the show. Jack had this strange accent that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Looking back, I'm not even sure it was real. He starts asking my friend the usual questions, and I notice she's absolutely bombing the interview. She doesn't have much experience and didn't bother to bring a portfolio. But despite this, he doesn't seem to care. The alarm in my head is much louder than a whisper, but it completely blares when he asks if she'd be comfortable doing lingerie shoots as well. My friend, the dear, sweet girl that she is, says she doesn't have an issue with it, but she'd prefer mostly to do sports clothing like they had discussed earlier. She asked to see some of his work, and he pulls up a lingerie Instagram. All lingerie, no clothing at all. He holds it in front of her face, and then pulls it away immediately. And when she asked if there was more that she'd be doing, Jack goes, "That was it," and hurries the conversation along. He then says that we need to go to a studio right now, at a place that he briefly mentioned the name of, to sign papers and get everything squared away. It has to be done today, because he's not working tomorrow, and his co-workers won't do it right. I absolutely hate everything about this, and I'm trying to glare some sense into her, but nothing is getting through. My friend agrees, and he turns his attention to me. "Do you want to be a part of this too?" I immediately know that nothing about this is professional. I look down at my beat-up docs and green cargo pants, a shirt that has flames and a slightly edgy logo on it, and I can't help but scoff. That's not really my thing. I'm just the ride. He studies me for a second, and then says that we all can ride with him, directing his attention to my friend. "No, I don't want to leave my car. We'll follow you." He looks slightly offended that I chose to butt in, but asks where we parked. "Right in front of the store." I got it. I pull my friend to the Jeep and make sure we walk behind him. As soon as we get into the car, I lock the doors and try to keep from freaking out. We are absolutely not going. This doesn't feel right. What about the lingerie? Everything I say she has an excuse for. We pull out. I follow Jack's SUV, but the whole time I'm trying to figure out how we get out of this. My friend doesn't like the lingerie, but this could be a door for her, and she desperately needs the cash. What if it is legit? He was alone anyways. You have your knife and spray, right? Were all questions that she asked. Of course I do, but I'm 5'2" and this man's 6'3". Jack could very much have friends, and I don't want to possibly kill or be killed over this. We drive along as I try to talk to her, and we start driving out into the desert, the middle of absolute nowhere. There's a divider in the road that prevents U-turns, and I get an eerie feeling that Jack knew to take us this way. I'm absolutely desperate at this point. I pull out my phone, snap a picture of Jack's SUV license plate. I upload it to Snapchat where my friends can see it. The name of the place he mentioned springs back into my head, and I know it's familiar from somewhere, a commercial jingle that's distant but catchy. It's a restaurant or a hotel or something. He wouldn't have a studio there. Just look it up, I implore my friend to do. She does so. It's a casino. Unless this man has rented out a space, he wouldn't have a studio there. It's not consistent with the information he gave us at all. My friend is rightfully freaked at this point. I tell her that this isn't uncommon, and he was trying to confuse us the entire time. Throughout the entire interview, she had a confused and hesitant look on her face, like this wasn't what she was promised or expecting at all. She finally agrees that we need to get out of there, and I start to breathe easily again. I notice that every 5 minutes or so, there's a break in the median. It's a rough, quick stop and turn around, but it'll have to do. So I do it, and we absolutely gun it. My friend gets a call from Jack, and at first she ignores it. But I convince her to call back, and she gets nothing at all, like the number had blocked her. Her call didn't go through. I tell her to screenshot the Craigslist ad, but she can't find it anywhere. It's like every trace of Jack that she had disappeared. We go back to her apartment. I tell her she needs to report this. She promises she will, but later, because she doesn't want her husband to know. He didn't even know she had this interview to begin with, and she didn't want him to know what had happened. If I hadn't driven her, she would have gone alone, without telling a soul, and who knows what could have happened. I tried to not scold her too badly, but I just reminded her that our city was very different and much more dangerous than where she's from. Sweet girl, I hope you're a little more awakened to the world, and I'm sorry for that. It's been a few months since we split ways, and I'm still worried to death over all the oblivious crazy things that you get into. Since this incident, I now have 3 pepper sprays and a new pocket knife to carry around. I'm almost 4 months pregnant now, finally ready to get out of this damn dangerous city. Please, whoever may be listening to this, be safe out there. It's such a scary world, and be damn careful with Craigslist. Jack, if you're really the scary guy my gut deemed you to be, f*** you, and let's not ever meet again. We've all had bad dates, right? Well, this is the only date that I've ever had that rang every alarm bell and waved every single red flag. I'll preface this by saying I don't go on many dates, but when I do, I make sure that I follow safety protocol by only meeting my date in public places, letting either family or friends know where I'm going, and parking in a populated place close by to wherever we meet. Anyway, this date initially suggested we meet at his house to watch a movie and have a few drinks. I said no, I don't feel comfortable with that, and I only want to meet in public. He seemed okay with this, but then brought it up a few more times, and I said if money is an issue, we could meet up another time, or forget about it altogether. But my date backtracked and went with my idea of meeting at a cafe that I chose, one that I was familiar with, and equidistant to where we both lived. Anyway, he turns up in a 2-door car, this detail will be relevant soon, and goes into the cafe, and I follow behind as I introduce myself. After a polite introduction, things begin to get weird rather quickly. I order a Coke, and he says, "Don't you want a drink? I was going to pop into the bar," which I guess is connected to the cafe, "and get one." I say, "No, I'm not drinking." And he looks at me like, "What the fuck?" As if I'm being unreasonable. I already explained in messages I don't drink as I'm on medication, so having to re-explain it again kinda pissed me off. He seemed disappointed and goes to order a cider from the bar while I grab a table. We sit down with our drinks, and Date immediately goes on about going back to his place again, even though the original plan was to stay here and order food. And I had already made it clear, "Dude, I'm not going back to your house." He says something along the lines of having a few drinks and eating at his place. And I said, "We don't have to eat. We can just have our drinks and leave." He gets defensive, says he has money, but prefers if we go back to his place. I make a joke and say, "You're not a killer, are you?" And instead of laughing it off, he stares at me uncannily and says, "You don't think I would hurt you, do you?" I laugh uncomfortably and say, "Of course not. But really, I'm relieved this date won't be going any further." Date suddenly says, "Are you going to follow me in your car? Because that wouldn't make sense. How about we go in my car, but I've got packages in the front, so you have to squeeze in the back, and I'll drop you back off at your car later." In reality, that made far less sense than me following him in my own car and then driving home from his house after. The fact it was completely illogical made it even more creepy in my mind. Every alarm bell was going off at this point. I said, "Look, I don't want to go to your place, and your insistence is giving me the creeps." Date looks pretty shocked. He mumbles something about needing to use the bathroom and excuses himself from the table. A few moments later, I see him through the cafe window getting into his car and driving off. Massive bullet dodged, in my opinion. Also, the fact that his car didn't have back doors just made this feel all the more sinister. I keep imagining if something happened in that car and I wouldn't be able to escape. I was amazed at how many red flags and warnings could go off in such a short amount of time. But once he was gone, I was able to enjoy my Coke in silence, by myself. It actually turned into a really lovely evening, especially considering what it could have been.